Today we're going to continue expanding the east end of downtown. We'll be working in this area, focusing on the historic buildings that survived the addition of the freeway and the car-centric development that, of course, accompanied it. We're going to start off with some quick adjustments to the road network. Because this stretch of frontage road that runs next to the freeway would have been built at the same time as the freeway itself, I thought it would make more sense to have the two networks run as close as possible to each other so that they don't waste too much space in between. The frontage road is also going to serve as a collector road for this angled part of the grid, so I thought it made sense to try to swing it over here and connect it to the street grid directly, rather than connecting over to this very low traffic road coming from the brewery district. Although I am going to add this kind of extended slip lane across this parkland just for fun. The resulting intersections are a little bit ugly, but it's nothing that a little IMT work can't fix. In the form of these little peninsulas, or whatever they're called, just these little pointy pieces of concrete, to stop people from turning left into or off of the slip lane. I guess it's really more for discouraging than for actually outright stopping people from doing it, because you could always just choose to drive right over them if that's what you really wanted. Speaking of the existential angst of freedom, I decided to kick off the build with something completely from my imagination. I stumbled across this Art Deco building on the workshop, which, although I can't say it's like the perfect fit for the area, I do really like it. I mean, I think it's Dutch, and it's meant to be more in a wall-to-wall context, obviously. So not quite the same as this area of the city, but it does have this really nice brick facade, which I think fits into the palette of textures and colors that we have in our historic buildings throughout the city. I'm thinking that this would have originally been built as some kind of concert hall or something similar to that before World War II, or our world's version of World War II. And I think that makes sense given that the East End would have been a pretty hoity-toity, wealthy, and exclusive area at the time. And then after the war, as the neighborhood became a bit more middle class, it was remodeled into a community center. And at that time, the whole block would have been claimed to make room for the outdoor area, which has a hockey rink and a few basketball courts, because those are what I could fit into this small area. This block is one of the steepest that we have to work in the vicinity of the freeway, so I had to get a little bit creative with the detailing. Sometimes I do just let the terrain clip into a building like this if it doesn't look too bad, but in this case I definitely needed more control over the way they interact. So I decided to build a tiered plaza leading from the entrance up to the sports area. I'm using these brick walls, which I think look really nice, and grouping them together in PO so that they can get a somewhat consistent slope. And then the floor of each tier is just some ploppable pavement to make a nice base for detailing in a moment. The entrance plaza is a little bit sunken just because of the sloped node at the intersection, which kind of angles the road networks up a little bit. So I'm going to add in these stairs to make up the difference in height, which actually kind of makes it look like a sunken plaza, which looks kind of cool. Maybe doesn't make too much sense given how steep the block is, but oh well. I thought that the plain pavement was a little bit boring, so I'm going to take this excellent tile decal and slather the whole thing in it like ketchup on hot dish. Is that what you put on hot dish? I don't know. I felt like the building needed a couple of hints to its more modern renovation. So we have this modern extension that slots nicely into the asset. Maybe this would house like event space, or maybe there's some division of the city administration that's housed here. But whatever its purpose is, they also get a little parking lot, which I think kind of nicely balances out the pedestrian-friendly plaza on the other corner. Because the road is slightly sloped here, the building is raised a little bit off the ground, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to add in a wheelchair-accessible ramp. On the upper tier, I'm going to make this disused hockey rink by just adding in a wood wall around it in IMT, and then a couple of stain decals to roughen it up. It's definitely a pretty gray and kind of boring area in its own right, but I think this is a very iconic thing that you see in cold climates during the summer, so you get these disused hockey rinks. So it should add a nice bit of realism, especially when you see it from the aerial view. The rest of the block isn't too much to scream about, since it's mostly just the same kinds of details carried across the rest of the upper tier, although there is this kind of weird utility area baked into the asset, so I'm going to toss a few pieces of industrial junk down there just to make it look useful. Then it's really just a matter of a line of some of the tastiest looking trees in my asset collection, along with some big lights around the hockey rink. For the remaining blocks, I wanted to focus more on smaller buildings that fit a bit more neatly into the grid and more explicitly exhibit the encroachment of car centricity upon the historic architecture. So I'm going to try to do this by placing a number of the buildings that would be most likely to be preserved, kind of as anchors for each block, and then I'm going to alternate those lots with the different kinds of development that we've done over the last couple episodes in this area of town. So pre-war houses and brick infill alongside the more modern apartments, and then of course the car-centric shops and offices that I talked about last episode, although that's going to feature more next episode, but we'll get to that later. We're going to start with this big church, which I think comes all the way from Perth, but fits nicely into the environs of Amaranth Bay. It has a lot of similar architectural features to many of the other historic buildings, and it just looks like a really nice asset. I'm going to use a lot of the same assets and techniques to detail this building as I did the community center, adding in some stairs and ramps to compensate for the slope. Although this time, because it is set quite a ways back from the road, I'm going to soften everything up by filling in the empty areas with grass. But I think all these extra details just help to integrate it into the context a little bit more. The next historic building is going to be loosely inspired by this one in Duluth, called the Kitchi Gammi Club. I hope I pronounced that correctly, which was opened in 1914. Apparently, Kitchi Gammi is the Ojibwe name for Lake Superior, or maybe to be more chronologically precise, Lake Superior is the English name for Kitchi Gammi. And this is a name that you'll find not uncommonly used in names for local businesses. Anyway, I couldn't find an asset quite like this building on the workshop, so I'm going to kind of make up my own thing based around this classic guy, which is Jubilee Hall by Darf, who I don't think has ever put out a bad asset. I wanted the detailing here to be a touch fancier to represent the private money that's poured into this building over the years. So around the exterior of the plot, you have a wrought iron fence with some brick posts to kind of tie the texture together with the brick in the facade of the building. Around back, though, you have a different expression of how this place has influenced the appearance of the city here, where the alley has been torn up to make way for both the north wing of this building and also the private lot around back. This thing was kind of a pain to build because of the slope, but I think it was necessary to have some kind of network back here so as to not have any unnatural clipping of terrain into the building, and also just to make the height of everything here look reasonable. To make the slope difference not feel so extreme, I'm going to go for a bit of a compromise where the entrance to the drive is at quite a high level relative to the building, and then the pull-through lot slopes downward to the next floor down. I just thought it would look a little strange to have the front of the building be like 5 stories and then have the back only be 2, so I think even adding that one extra floor, at least in appearance, makes it feel a bit more substantial and realistic. I imagine at one point this would have been a more landscaped drive meant for pedestrians or maybe even horse-drawn wagons back in the good old days before cars and the polio vaccine. At some point they paved that over and added some parking spots. Isn't that a song? It's like a Bob Dylan song. I think Bob Dylan was from Duluth. Anyway, even with this parking area raised up quite high relative to the building, there's still a sharp gap in between it and the road level, so I just need to build a quick retaining wall to take care of that, which will be done in a pinch courtesy of intersection marking tool. despite the total lack of intersections or markings involved in this build. Other than that, this place just needs a little bit of foliage and some other small details to bring it together and get it looking nice and fancy, including a few old trees that they managed to not bulldoze while making the parking lot. To kick off the more car-centric part of the build, I'm going to upgrade this main avenue from a meager 2-lane road with tram tracks to a 4-lane road with tram tracks because, as you know, more lanes is always the best solution to increase traffic. But I think in this case that might actually be true because this avenue is going to become the main way that people exiting the freeway coming in this direction will enter downtown. Because the only 4-lane road I had in this width was the vanilla one, I think it's vanilla, I do have to come back and add in the proper double yellow line with IMT, but I'm not going to bore you with that. Instead, I will bore you with the first car-centric build, which is a pizza. Unfortunately, they did not respond to my email asking them for a sponsorship, so their name will be censored for the remainder of the video. I was really just trying to feel out how to do these kinds of builds and how to fit parking lots into this steep terrain, which can be pretty tough. For these kinds of builds where you have the building up against the road and then the parking lot up against the alley, ideally I would like to have the lots be connected to the alley by a small driveway, but often that ends up just not being a viable option due to the extreme slope, at least in this area. As you'll see next episode, it does get a little easier to do that kind of build as we move farther away from the downtown because the hill begins to level out a little bit. Anyway, in this kind of situation, I think a retaining wall is not an unrealistic option to cover up the difference in elevation, and they're pretty easy to put together using IMT and sometimes a couple of props. It's quite a bit easier to build on the upper halves of these blocks because you can always add things to the foundations of the buildings that are exposed around back, or you can cover them up in some other way. And that's just easier to do than a retaining wall or something like that. Another thing you can do in some cases when you have a taller building like this modern apartment is to sink it down into the ground so that the back of the building isn't quite so high above the level of the alley. In this particular case, that of course also hides the street level entrances around front, so I have to come back and manually add in these kind of dummy commercial buildings just to serve as entrances. Around back, despite having lowered the building down quite a way, there's still a bit of foundation showing, so I'm going to make it look a bit more purposeful with this bigger generic shop front, and then the remaining space is going to get turned into a parking lot, of course. Obviously, this is way too small of a parking lot for this size of an apartment building, so I'm thinking that it would be supplemented by a parking garage beneath the building, which you can see accessed by this garage door over here. Speaking of parking lots, another technique for building them that I kind of like is the good old alternating lots. And what I mean by that is that, well, in this case, we have a fancy old synagogue on one corner and a more modern fancy restaurant on the other. So kind of these unique anchor buildings that give the block a little bit of character, which I feel like is important in this context. And then next to each of these, you have a parking lot that runs the whole depth of the lot. And you can imagine that long ago, there would have been buildings of some sort here, shops or houses or something like that, which were bought up by the adjacent buildings to tear down and serve as their new parking lots. It's a useful technique because it allows for a nice, gently sloped parking lot without having to worry about retaining walls or anything like that. Plus, they're just really easy to build because you just need one segment of whatever road you're using and a couple of parking spot assets. But I try not to use it too much in the build overall because so many of the lots you see in real life in this kind of context have the building set back from the road behind a line or more than one line of parking spots. So it really only fits into this sort of transition zone between downtown and the lower density, more recently developed areas that are going to have massive parking lots for every single building pretty much. Anyway, you can see a little hint of what it once would have been like here in these lots that have been demolished and turned into parking lots with these few houses that are in between them. I really like this kind of eclectic block where you have unique buildings mixed in with parking lots, mixed in with older houses. You seem to get a lot of that in Duluth, and I feel like it gives a character to the city that you wouldn't really get from like perfectly zoned districts. Plus, they're really fun to detail because you don't just have to do the same kind of thing over and over again. You have to figure out how to transition in between the different types of lots and how to make everything feel realistic and fleshed out. To finish off today's build, I wanted to shift our focus to how the hospital and freeway have encroached on the land around these historic buildings, partly taking inspiration from this block in Duluth. You can see here how the exposed portion of the freeway runs through this half block and how the historic brewery district was saved on the other side, thankfully. This side of the freeway, though, is a different story. The buildings here were completely torn down around the time of the freeway project to make room for satellite buildings for the hospital campus. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but there is one bad thing about all of this, which is that it happened around the 1970s, so we get 1970s architecture out of it. On the corner, we have this medical office building, which is something I've been wanting to use since I first saw it on the workshop, because it looks like literally every single medical adjacent building in my city. Next to that, we have this one building, which I'm thinking is the single original building that they would have kept during the project due to its historical status. It was some important business back in the day, and it's on the historical register. Then on the far corner, there's this two-tone office building, which I'm going to make by clipping in a second PO copy of the building that is sized just slightly up so that the facade can cover up the base of the building on all sides. I'm going to take a cue from Duluth here, and instead of bothering with slope or anything like that, I'm just going to have the lots be level with the lower elevation road, which is the frontage road running next to the freeway. And that gives everything a pretty sharp look once the retaining walls and other details get added in. So I kind of like that. Although I imagine it's probably not so pedestrian friendly because you can't cut across the block through an alleyway or a parking lot or anything like that, which might not sound like much, but that is something that I always end up doing to save quite a bit of time when I'm trying to navigate a car-centric city on foot, which is always fun. If the cause of all this rebuilding was the growth of the hospital and the addition of the freeway, I figured that it would make sense that there would have been growing demand for housing in this neighborhood at the time. So the remaining two half blocks here are going to be home to an apartment complex. I went into this build telling myself that it would be low detail and that I wouldn't turn the buildings into POs, but that lasted about 5 seconds because they just didn't fit into the space that I had available. I do think that it worked out in the end though, because it meant that I could flip the second L-shaped building to mirror the other one, which I feel like makes it look more like a single cohesive development rather than a simple copy and paste job. And I can remedy the population issue by just adding in some high-density residential blocks and clipping them into these buildings. One thing that I definitely cannot remedy is the fact that this streetcar decapitated itself. But the detailing is pretty similar to the previous block, except in this case, the parking lot is up along the main avenue rather than down on the frontage road. I don't know exactly why I chose to do this, but it really seemed a bit more of like a 1970s apartment complex thing to do it that way. And if that seems like way too many acres of concrete right outside their front doors, maybe that would lead to crippling depression and alienation and rock bottom quality of life. Don't worry, because they're going to have a few planters outside of each entrance, and we're also going to add a few trees planted around the remaining sides of the buildings. Down below, we have a number of pedestrian entrances, although frankly, I'm not sure why anyone would want to walk along this frontage road along the freeway, but that's not important right now. In between the L-shaped building and the smaller one, there is a little drive, which is basically just meant for garbage access. The very last block for today is going to be kind of a weird one. I've had this spot earmarked for a park for quite some time, but I thought that a boring old full block park is not really going to evoke the kind of history that I'm going for here. So what I decided to do was dedicate half the block to a park, like I had originally planned, and half the block as kind of a microcosm of everything else going on in this district. For the park itself, I went with a pretty basic geometric looking path layout. I thought about adding in some stairs here, but honestly, the block isn't that steep overall, so I just stuck with the flat paths, and I assume that all these Sims already have pretty sturdy ankles anyway because they live on the side of a massive hill. I think that this park would be fairly old, although probably not quite as old as the original hospital building or some of the other historic buildings we put down earlier. So it's going to have some pretty substantial trees, but not like the biggest ones in the city. I did leave a big gap in the middle so that people walking through the park can get a nice view down toward the freeway. Sorry, the lake. For the car-centric part of the microcosm, we have a medium-sized satellite parking lot for the hospital, which they had to put here because they weren't able to get the rights to tear up the park and add it closer to the campus. It's still pretty convenient though, because you can park here and then take the streetcar 1 block over to the hospital. I'm only half kidding about that. It ends up looking a bit sloppy because this was the beginning of me getting really sick of building parking lots in this part of town. Which is kind of a problem because the next episode is the car-centric part of this build, but let's cross that bridge when we get there. How about that? In the remaining quadrant, you have the historic remnants, with a big mansion on the corner, which has been converted into a funeral home, which seems kind of fitting to have in the vicinity of a hospital. Yeah, and on that cheery note, we have the final historic buildings, which are, or maybe not historic, but older buildings, which are the pre-war single-family home and brick infill combo that I have used so many times over the last couple builds, and am still not tired of, because I just think it looks really nice. Anyway, back here, there's a small remnant of the alley that is still here to access the backs of the houses. And of course, that's fenced off from those pesky hordes of people who are using the pedestrian thoroughfare to access the park. Why are there so many people here? I don't understand. And with that, we are done with the historic remnants of the East End. Next episode, like I hinted at before, will be the even more car-centric area with some shopping centers and that sort of thing. So hopefully you're looking forward to that. And thank you for watching. Thank you to my channel members, with a special shout out to my $5 tier members, Fainted, New, Peter J, and Victor Sellen.